Okay, let's dive in. We're looking at, well, what one source has bluntly called a disaster season for a
Yeah.
huge historic club. We're talking Manchester United, of course. And today we're doing a deep dive into some specific analysis, some commentary that really digs into their recent struggles, looking at the team, the management, and, debating what might happen next.
Exactly. Our mission here is to unpack the key arguments,
Mm.
the strong personal opinions, the analysis, and maybe some of the forecasts that came up in this particular material we reviewed. The aim is really to help you understand the different angles, the debates surrounding this whole situation at United right now.
Mm-hmm. Because there's this real core tension, isn't there? You've got this, well, objectively very poor season on one hand, and then these public statements trying to inspire hope for the future on the other. It's a fascinating clash, ripe for analysis. So, yeah, let's unpack what this source had to say.
So the description of the season itself, no punches pulled, called the disaster straight up, and arguably the worst season for them. They even made the comparison with Spurs, saying at least Spurs finished higher, while United, well, they ended up without a trophy despite maybe a cup run.
And the league position mentioned in this specific analysis, 15th apparently after a final game win against Villa 2-0, gives you a sense of the low point discussed.
Right, and after that game, the manager's message to the fans was highlighted. The source quoted him saying something like, "After this disaster season, I want to tell you the good days are coming. If there is one club that has proven in the past they can overcome any situation, any disaster, it is our club. It is Manchester United." Strong words.
And the reaction from the people discussing this in our source material, let's just say inspired, wasn't the word used. It was more along the lines of, well, they can't really get any worse next year, can they? Which is pretty blunt, but maybe highlights a feeling that they've hit rock bottom, according to this analysis anyway.
What's really interesting, though, is where this analysis immediately pivoted, the why behind the disaster. And the core problem they hammered home, presented as a very strong opinion, mind you, was player recruitment. Specifically, needing players who, quote, know the Premier League.
Yeah, that was a huge theme, a major critique. The argument laid out was that, the majority of signings over the last 2 or 3 years are players who've never played in the Premier League.
Mm-hmm.
And the verdict was they've just struggled to adapt, especially when you bring in so many new faces like that all at once. It's not just about raw talent, is it? It's about fit.
Exactly. And they drew a really stark contrast with Chelsea in their analysis. Pointing out Chelsea's younger squad, average age 24, I think they said they did get into the Champions League. And the reason given, because that Chelsea group did have players who knew the league, players who were, quote, hard to play against and would roll their sleeves up. It kept coming back to that specific player profile.
So what's needed then, according to this view? It sounds like a call to, well, go back to basics. Bring in really good, proper, experienced players described as men, robust, the types who turn up week in, week out, reliability.
Mm-hmm. And the most cutting quote used in the source, the one they called the biggest insult a team can face, was that this United team is easy to play against and they're easy to beat.
Wow, that really hits home. And they didn't back down from that point, did they? The firm belief expressed was that this current group of players have shown this year they're not up to it, at least not in the league. And this isn't new, apparently spanning the last couple of years.
Right. And the forecast tied to that analysis is pretty stark. This won't just magically change overnight, regardless of manager or tactics, unless they bring in fundamentally different types of players, specifically those guys who know the league inside out, the kind of men they described like players the speaker recalled playing with who just knew the league, would turn up every week, and were just fundamentally hard to beat. That mix of experience and mentality seemed absolutely crucial in their view.
Okay, so building on that pretty harsh critique of the squad, the source also touched on whether this season, as bad as it was, could actually be, well, a turning point. The idea discussed was that the manager might have inferred he actually expected this kind of storm, saw short-term pain as maybe necessary for longer-term progress. Could this be rock bottom before the rebuild?
It's a narrative you sometimes hear, isn't it? Fewer games next season. Maybe a big clear out of players. You can sort of see how someone might frame it that way. But, this is important, the skepticism in the source was really strong. They pointed out, look, there have been a lot of turning points talked about before at United, and often it feels like the club's been searching for a short-term fix rather than committing to the hard long-term changes needed.
Right. And while they acknowledge new people coming in, like CEO Jason Wilcox, who they said knows the game and what it takes, possibly referencing his background, The analysis still stressed that any real meaningful progress from this point, it's going to take time. No magic wands here.
And speaking of potentially drastic measures coming out of this analysis, one of the most provocative questions raised was basically, how many of these current players would you not sell this summer?
That's a pretty radical framing of the situation.
It is. And the opinion offered in response was just as stark, almost extreme. Every single United player will be up for sale, full stop. The only potential exception mentioned was maybe Lenny Euro, and that seems mostly because he's young and hasn't really been part of the longer-term issues discussed. It just shows the depth of the perceived failure.
They even got into specifics like debating selling Bruno Fernandes, even though he's often seen as their best player.
Yeah, they did. They acknowledged he's clearly a leading light, a game changer, a top footballer, absolutely. But the opinion put forward quite strongly was that if the right money came about and you could then invest into the squad, well, then you certainly take the right money.
Even acknowledging he was probably their standout player this year, though they did apparently question his form in one recent game. It really highlights the kind of tough, maybe even ruthless decisions being debated in this source.
Mm-hmm. And there was also some skepticism directed at the manager's comments about maybe having fewer games next season or having a free week with the players being some kind of advantage.
The idea that less football automatically means better results was questioned.
Directly, yes. The counter-argument presented was pretty clear. Part of playing for a big club is more games. That's the environment. That's where you learn, where you build resilience and experience. Calling the idea of a free week being universally good for a club like United bizarre was the term used in the analysis. Top clubs want to be busy playing important matches.
Right. It's not like a free week suddenly lets you wave a magic wand and fix fundamental issues with players. That justification seemed to get picked apart quite a bit in the source.
So looking ahead then, the forecast offered wasn't exactly, full of wild optimism about an instant turnaround. But it did set a very clear baseline expectation based on how bad this season was perceived to be.
The absolute lowest bar imaginable, basically.
Pretty much summed up as, they cannot get any lower than this, surely. There was a definite feeling expressed that something has to happen next season. It simply has to be better than this.
And interestingly, even with the really severe critique of the squad, calling them easy to beat, questioning their robustness and mentality, there was still this underlying opinion articulated that, despite everything, the group still should be doing better than they showed.
Yeah, it implies there's perhaps more in that squad if the recruitment around them gets better and the structure, the whole setup, is right going forward. So it's a complex picture, blaming the player's profile, but also suggesting the environment hasn't helped.
Okay, so let's try and pull the threads together from this specific source material we've been diving into.
Sure. I think the core takeaways are, first, a clear consensus that the season was indeed a disaster. That's the starting point for all the analysis. Second, a really strong central opinion that the fundamental problem lies with the profile of players recruited, that lack of Premier League know-how, being men, being robust, that came through loud and clear.
Right. And then the debate around potentially radical changes needed.
Exactly. Including the provocative idea that maybe even key figures like Bruno Fernandes could be sold if the price allows for significant reinvestment in the right type of players.
And finally, that skepticism about some of the manager's justifications balanced against a cautious hope that with new leadership like Wilcox and better alignment, maybe this could be a genuine turning point.
But, and it's a big but, the forecast heavily emphasized it will absolutely take time. No quick fixes expected.
Yeah, this was definitely a deep dive into a specific conversation that was full of, sharp analysis, some very strong personal opinions, lots of debate about what exactly went wrong, and forecasts about what needs to change, maybe drastically. It really lays bare the scale of the challenge from this perspective.
And you can see the parallels, can't you? When you think about turning around any big organization, whether it's sport or business or anything else, it often involves these really difficult, sometimes uncomfortable debates. You've got to honestly look at the failures, figure out what kind of talent, what profile you actually need for that specific challenge, and then make tough calls, deciding which parts, which people are essential moving forward, and which, might need to be replaced even if they seem valuable on paper. It's all about getting that alignment right between the talent and the demands of the situation.
It certainly gives you a lot to think about. So here's a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over, based purely on the analysis and opinions we discussed from these sources today. Given that strong critique we heard about the squad lacking players who know the Premier League and are hard to beat, which single characteristic that was discussed, that league experience, being robust or consistently turning up week in, week out, which one do you think is the absolute most critical factor Manchester United needs to get right in their recruitment to avoid another disaster season? Something to consider.